is where we discuss the possibilities.
Hi guys, I'm Joe Klemczewski, founder of The Diet Doc, here once again with Dr. Souders, our medical director at The Diet Doc. Welcome again, Jen.
Hi, Joe. Nice to have you with me again and me be with you. It's going to just keep having fun here, huh?
Yes, and in retrospect, after we talked, I had named this series Good Diets, Bad Diets. And a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because I'm not that much of a value statement kind of guy. I don't think you're that way either. But I did want to emphasize throughout this series that there certainly is a lot of misinformation out there, and there are good ways to apply principles from just about anything. But I also get very bogged down with some of the stuff that I know people are presented. For example, one of our owners in Australia contacted me over the weekend saying, hey, what do you think about this? And there was some kind of a, quote, fitness professional over there really purporting some dumb stuff, just physiology that's not even fantastical. It's just wrong. So I always feel a little bit responsible to our program owners and our clients, and even just having any kind of a media presence at least addressing some of those things. So you as a medical doctor, as a physician, you're probably even more acutely aware than I am how dangerous this can be. So talk about that for just a second, if you can, as a physician. What do you think needs to be addressed in culture at large?
So yeah, information and misinformation. I would say there's only one truly bad diet, and that would be starvation. Mm-hmm. And we define starvation as this is very specific. It's an involuntary lack of food. So not to differentiate it from fasting, which is a voluntary lack of food for a discerned time period, and starvation is an involuntary lack of food for an indeterminate period. So that, I think, is one thing of groundwork I'd like to say is not being a values person. In terms of information, misinformation, I think that people oftentimes latch onto what's popular. Mm-hmm. So whatever's popular in culture. And I mean, that's natural. I think as medical professionals, what we need to do is to ask them what their baseline level of knowledge is and what is their desire for following a certain type of diet or dietary plan, because they may have preconceived notions or misconceptions that is influencing their choice. And our role is education, just as all of the nutritional consultants in the Diet Doc. The role is education to try and make sure that we understand where the patient's coming from, what they're after, what they want to achieve, what they think they're going to achieve on any given structured diet plan, and then also go through with them what the potential pitfalls are. So, for instance, when we talk about various diets, one of the things that I will just qualify at the beginning is there are some diets that may not be appropriate for the general public, but that certain people, it will work very well for them. And when I think of our, very obese, very highly insulin resistant people, they may need a very different approach than the general population. But again, those are people who typically are taking a lot of medications. They need to have medical oversight very closely, because their medications are going to probably have to be adjusted and altered and changed if the diet is working. So I would say, as I'm coming from a position of medicine, not just education, but oversight for specific populations. And I think we've touched on this before, but we are all genetically and metabolically and environmentally different. There are some things that will just work for some people sometimes, mm-hmm. and we don't know why, but they just mm-hmm. will. And I do think there is something to, if you want to call it the placebo effect, if a patient really believes this is the thing, and that if they really, really want to try it and they really believe in their heart that this is going to work for them, you need to pay attention to that, because if that person is that motivated or has that belief, they may do better on that just simply because of the way they're going to invest themselves in it.
Oh, great point. And that's I think the best way to even state that is their motivation level because of their buy-in could be extremely high. And that's a great nuance in what I want to talk about today, which is carbs versus no carbs. And I will probably go to my deathbed having this argument because it just keeps recycling itself. And I take a stance that, as you just said, there are times in anybody's diet where you might want to be very, very low in carbohydrates for a variety of reasons and then graduate out of that, or as you said, for your environmental conditions, for your genetics. But there is some, what I think is just foundational evidence in the research that I don't think is going to be overturned. And I'll throw a couple of those out there at you and we can talk about them. Number one is the Journal of the American Medical Association did a 59 study review or looked at 59 diets in a meta-analysis. And out of 59 diets, and they ranked them, which are the best for sustainable, permanent, long-term weight loss. Guess how many were low-carb diets out of 59? 0. So for sustainability, we can start there where we can say, okay, if there are some principles to reducing carbs, which are obvious, you have to reduce calories somewhere. So carbs are going to come down to a certain percentage. The USDA recommends 45 to 65%. I think that's pretty fair. Even if you go on the low end, 45% or a little bit lower. But just in terms of that as a preface to our conversation, what are your thoughts?
I think that that is really consistent with, my experience with people in general as to what works for them. I would say that the key for everybody is the sustainability. We all know the statistics. People can lose weight. Here in this country, we're champs at losing weight. We lose it all the time. And many people yo-yo diet. And the problem is that after they lose it successfully on whatever plan, but it's not a plan that they can or they want to continue for life. So when they go back to eating normally, however you want to define that, the long-term sustainability and success isn't there. And so they go back and they gain weight and they regain everything and then some above that as well. So I agree with the findings, and I think that really when we're looking at people in medicine or just in health in general, sustainability and maintenance is really the goal. People think of weight loss as the goal, but that is a process to lead to a lower maintenance and sustainability. And I think we also need to focus on the fact that people will settle at different weights and points, either through the process or for them. And the other thing that we see so much is that just small changes, 10, 15% loss of body mass yields really, really big changes in health and risk profiles. And so those are the things, again, that I think people need to be focusing on is, not only is your weight loss working, but is the diet that you're choosing also benefiting your risk profile going forward? Because it doesn't really help you to look great in a bikini but on the inside have, a number of massive disease risk profiles that are popping up positive on your work, your blood work, and, based on your genetics and unmodifiables, age, gender, so forth.
Mm-hmm. And to your point about sustainability, Harvard and the University of Toronto both did studies looking at long-term sustainability in terms of binge eating disorder and other disordered patterns of eating. And they showed that a low-carb or no-carb diet, high-fat diet, were the greatest at creating binge eating disorder. And even if that's subtle, let's say somebody doesn't have a full-blown disorder that they are now seeking treatment for, but if it's just your pattern to go so low on carbs that every week or two or a couple times a week, you're just mowing down a bag of, Oreos or something like that, you just get into that psychology of I'm a failure, I'm horrible at this. Why is everybody else, having such an easy time and I'm not? And it's that setup of a ketogenic, low carb diet that is failing you, not you failing it. So, I think you have had a little bit of experience with some low carb diets personally or with some patients. So what have you found in that area?
So I'll tell you about my own experience. There's nothing like going through it yourself. I was on a medical ketogenic diet for a severe health reason. And let's talk about what the differences are between the various ketogenic diets. So the ketogenic diet in medicine began, I believe, in the 1920s, and it was a response to helping to treat epilepsy. What they found was that children with very difficult intractable epilepsy had better seizure controls when they were fasting. So that's great. And fasting is, very helpful, but we can't fast forever, right? So when people are ketogenic dieting, I don't think they realize it, but basically what they're doing is trying to eat in a manner that creates an internal energy pathway and metabolic milieu that mimics fasting without fasting. So, I mean, we could be trite about it and say, yeah, keto's for people who can't handle fasting. But really, if you're going to do it long term, obviously fasting's not an option. So for medical ketogenic, it is incredibly strict. That needs to have a dietitian. It needs to have really frequent testing. And I don't think this is what the general population is doing, but I'll tell you on the most extreme levels, you're looking at 20 grams of carbohydrates per day maximum. You can subtract your fiber from your fibrous carbs to yield net carbs. Excuse me. The purpose for that is to just simply give you enough fiber so that you can poo. It all comes down to poo again, Joe, doesn't it? It all comes down to poo. So two things happen on a ketogenic diet. Either you are massively constipated like a freaking brick, or you have that olestra kind of shart phenomenon where you're getting these, ooh, what was that kind of things, neither of which is socially very nice or personally very pleasant. So it causes a lot of GI problems. But people will not get enough soluble sources of fiber in their diet on that medical ketogenic diet to even bother about counting. It's incredibly restrictive, and it also requires you to have no processed foods and not even things like processed meats. So lunch meat, nope. Bacon, nope. People think of keto and they're thinking, oh, bacon and butter. But true medical ketogenic diet where you do have to maintain ketone levels and get blood tested has to be lower in protein too. So here are the challenges with a ketogenic diet. And let's contrast it with Atkins. Atkins, at least revised Atkins, had a bit higher protein level, up to about 35%. And we know that if you eat too much protein without sufficient carbohydrate, you're going to just pop into your gluconeogenesis pathway and you're going to make carbohydrate out of that protein.
Yep.
So there's that. So for true ketogenic dieting, you do have to watch your protein and keep it low. That means that most of your calories are coming from fat. That's a significant issue for risk profiles because if you go with plant-based sources of fat, they're more healthy. And I think the recent research has shown this, so you're probably aware of that if you're doing a ketogenic diet with more plant-based proteins, the profile, your cardiovascular risk factors, your blood work, looks pretty good. But if you're doing that, you're getting a lot of extra carbohydrate. There's still carbohydrate in nuts and nut butters and legumes and things. So it's really, really difficult to do and stay in true ketosis. I think what most people are doing is not probably yielding ketosis. It's very hard. You can pop out of ketosis easily, and you do have to keep track of your exercise. So in other words, you can get more carbs in if you do a 6-hour bike ride because you don't have very much glycogen and you're going to burn through anything else. So you can actually, if you're keto adapted, sneak in some carbs. But there's a lot of problems with doing that, and you really don't know where you are. So I think really all this is doing is giving people a structure. So so people are losing weight because they're cutting out food groups because they're utilizing a structure, and a structure that cuts out certain foods so that it limits choices, so that it narrows down what people can eat. And it helps them to stick to a certain series of guidelines. And if they stick to it, ultimately they're going to eat less because their food choices are more narrow. But if you read the keto blogs and things, everything is all about, binging and about their one free day, which I would say is not a good idea because it takes you 4 days to get back into keto again, and then the weekend comes. So what good is that, right? You're really not spending time in a true ketogenic state anyway. So for me, it was never worthwhile going off of it. And it is a difficult thing to do socially. Even though, now we have a lot of probably restaurants and things that are catering to it. What I've seen in some of the keto blogs too is just what we had with Atkins. Now we have all the treats coming out. So the low carb candy bars and the low carb pastries and the low carb pizza crusts. And what it really shows me is people just want to eat regular freaking food. Yeah.
I want to break in and address something that you brought up, because on the gastrointestinal side, it is truly a train wreck. I've never seen somebody attempting even a modified ketogenic diet that does not have a lot of symptoms leading toward colitis, ulcerative colitis, and all of that. Typically not on the constipation side, because they're eating enough fat, trying to, with a volumetric approach, get enough fiber. Again, they're not necessarily following a prescriptive diet to the letter that would be specifically ketogenic, but this modified, blog type diet. And so there's usually way too much fiber. They're using a lot of oils, and that's just a recipe for just having diarrhea all day. Have counseled so many people who've gone through that. But then what you said about when you add in saturated fat, because it is just a set of goalposts that I think people are attracted to. If I just don't eat carbs, I'm fine. And then you get into the old school Atkins, way before South Beach and paleo, that advertise that, yes, you can have your burgers and all of this stuff. But in one particular study, when they looked at the benefits of a low-carb diet, out of 80,000 women, there was a substantial decrease in the risk of diabetes and heart disease until, and I'm talking 20 to 30% reduction of risk, as soon as saturated fats came up to about 20 or 30% of their total fat, all of those decrease in the risks went back down to nothing, as if it's no better than any other type of diet. So if you're into a medical type ketogenic diet, you just have to do that. And I still don't think that has value, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But even if you're doing just a trendy modified keto, you then have to say, why am I really doing this? Am I getting any health benefit at all? And I'm going to say, according to the research, no, you're just not. As a matter of fact, when you look at metabolic sustainability and even fat loss in general, the higher carb, lower fat diets still win every time. I'll mention a couple more studies and then ask for your comments on this.
Yeah.
One really good study, I think, because they looked at so many different variances, tested as high as 60% carbs versus 60% fat, and then stair-stepped it down to 40, 20, etc. And they found that for sustainable metabolic capacity, lean body mass, etc., the higher the carbs, all the way up to 60% carbs and only 10 to 20% fat, that outperformed the higher fat every time. So there's a lot of these myths and meme-like mantras out there that say, oh, if you have more fat, your testosterone levels are higher and you can maintain more muscle, you have more energy. And all of that is just flatly false. But then when you look at all the research done with the same type of subjects, Dr. Kevin Hall, you and I have talked about from the NIH, he absolutely goes through the meticulous nature of study by doing inpatient testing, things like that, where they're looking at exact food intake. And there, I don't think, is a shred of doubt in his research that a higher carb diet outperforms in terms of fat loss, metabolism, lean body mass, compliance, all the things. I mean, there's just no benefit to a purely high fat or modified keto diet, unless, and this is where I'll pitch it back to you with that contextual nuance, you're just doing it for a short period of time, like a little bit of an induction to get your wheels under you, or you're coming down slightly into that simply because you prefer it, but not going all the way. So What do you think about all of that?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think as far as athletic performance, that's been pretty darn clear. I certainly can share my own experience, but I think my experience is not unique in any way. Really, because your protein needs to be down low, and closer to what the RDA is. For athletes, it's very hard to get enough protein on the high fat, low carb diet. And so that's a problem, because if you're training, first, your training performance is really not particularly good, but you're not able to really synthesize muscle. And so the research has shown we have more metabolic suppression as a result of these diets, and a greater loss of lean body mass. And I think that's a problem for a lot of people, because when that diet ends, if it becomes more than a short phase induction or something to help you with a specific goal, for instance, you're at a plateau, a few weeks of ketogenic work may be something that helps to get you past that plateau. Great, again, useful, but long term, as well as the sustainability problem, and I think you've seen this coming out of people, coming out of ketogenic diets with people that you've coached. You've got muscle mass problems, decreased muscle mass, decreased athletic performance. You've got gastrointestinal problems, and now you've got significant metabolic suppression. And so you can't just start eating like a normal person again either. So transitioning out is like a reverse diet, but on a much different kind of scale. It's longer, and it really requires time. First, you have to readjust all of the gastrointestinal flora in your gut. That doesn't happen very quickly, as we know. And sometimes it can be difficult to really return to that previous state of health and digestive function. So concerns for people would be, am I going to be able to eat a more varied diet in the future if I do this long term as opposed to shorter term? And what is it going to do in terms of my lean body mass? Because preservation of that is important. When we're losing weight, we don't want to be losing a lot of weight in terms of lean mass. We want to be maximizing fat loss. And although, low carb is king in the early stages of the diet, I think when we look at the longer term research, they even out over time. And I think partly a lot of that is the sustainability factor. People just can't really sustain it. And then there are different levels of low carb too that people don't talk about. So medical ketogenic, 20 grams or less. Most of the popular keto and what Atkins was about 50, and these are net carbs. So you can eat a Quest bar, which has actually 23 or 24 total grams of carbohydrates, but if it has 14 grams of fiber, which is usually low quality, poor kind of digestibility fiber. No hate mail from Quest here. I eat their bars all the time. But if you're subtracting that, what are we really taking in here in carbs anyway? And low carb in terms of performance, but sustainable is a little more like in the 50 to 100 grams, which is perfectly appropriate for some people who need to do something to adjust their metabolism to get past a plateau, or for, as you mentioned, some other temporary goals in terms of either stopping a weight loss stall, or physique competitors, or making weight for a weight class for an athlete or something like that.
Yeah, and anecdotally, personally, I have, through my 20-year career as a pro bodybuilder, tried, ketogenic diets. I mean, way back in the day when they were more popular, kind of in the late 90s as a resurgence. And I always came in with less lean body mass. I was never as lean. I looked just tiny, flat, small compared to what I could be. And there are such clear physiological reasons for that. And I've noted the same thing with hundreds of clients over the years. But number one, once your minimum protein requirements are met, there is nothing more anabolic or metabolic than carbohydrates. So we think of insulin as the bad guy, but in a controlled diet, especially in a deficit, insulin has good properties. That's what's controlling growth and recovery and maintenance. That's what shuttles glucose into the muscle cells in a positive way. So one of the things that really surprised me, Jen, I don't think I would have believed this 20 or 25 years ago, but somebody did a study showing that if you start somebody on a maintenance calorie diet and then you add 250 grams of carbs a day in addition to their maintenance needs, they did this study for 21 days, and they showed that only 6% of their extra calories from carbohydrates were converted to fat. And I've always thought, or at least back then, that almost instantly, any calories you consume above what you need at that moment get stored as fat. But truly, like protein, a higher quality carbohydrate does have a higher thermic effect. And then you have the buffers of whatever you need at that moment, whatever the context in your day is, you will use some of those carbohydrates as energy. You're stimulating your metabolism in a short-term and long-term way. And then you still have your glycogen system. You're going to store some of that in your liver, your muscle tissue, those transitional energy stores. So that's a massive finding to me. And I hope this is reproduced or attempted to in a couple of ways. But that showing that compared to fat, if you overconsume fat, it just instantly gets stored as fat. I mean, those are just the physiological facts. So those people who think that, well, yes, ketogenic dieting is hard, it's not easy, but it's better. I mean, show me one category where it's actually better. And unless you need it for a medical reason, I've been through every bit of research I can find, and I find nothing advantageous.
Right. And the goal medically is to get people out of that severe restrictive process of eating as quickly as possible. It's very dangerous as far as bone health. It creates an acidic environment. So it is very, you have to use a lot of caution in terms of women can in particular be very vulnerable to osteopenia, osteoporosis on that diet, kidney stones. It can be, with the lower protein, it's not so hard on the kidneys, but there's metabolic consequences, a lot of, vitamin deficiencies and things that need to be looked at and adjusted for. And I think those are risks. Maybe in societal ketogenic dieting, that's not so much of a risk. But I'm familiar with that study that you quoted, and I think that makes sense because when you eat fat, you can only do one thing with fat if you don't use it right away for presenting, some kind of need for cholesterol or structural changes or incorporation into cell walls and things. I mean, it just goes to fat, whereas it does take energy and effort on the part of the body to convert protein and carbohydrate to fat. I think really with people eating low carb is, again, I think it's structure, and you're a big structure guy, which I know that's going to get your little antennas going right here like that. But yeah, it is basically a structure kind of a setup, because what we eat in terms of carbohydrate in our standard Western diet is crap. I mean, okay, I went over on my carbohydrates yesterday a little bit. I love my carbohydrates, right? But here's what I ate. Here are my carbohydrate sources yesterday: apples, blueberries, salad greens, parsnips, carrots, sweet potatoes, dairy, nuts, some roasted chickpeas, and then I had some ice cream for dessert because I get that 20%, right? But I mean, when you look at that, if we're going to talk 80-20, you can have up to 20% of your calories can be in some kind of an indulgence if everything else is under wraps. I mean, how is that not a good, healthy, sustainable source of carbohydrate nutrition? I mean, that fuels you. It's a mix of starchy and fibrous. It provides a wide variety of vegetable-based nutrients, antioxidants, phytochemicals, all of the things that you really need. It's good for your gut health. There's a balance of having, both soluble and insoluble fibers in there, and yet enough volume that you're not just sort of slamming your gut with high concentration of sort of cheap soluble fibers that can cause a lot of digestive disease or at least digestive upset, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what a good point to end with, that even if you do buy into the fact that carbohydrates are not the bad guy, they certainly still can be a pretty poor choice if you're comparing just a bag of potato chips to a whole food that you prepare. So definitely always consider health, and there are ramifications to even what's happening with your goals if you're eating extremely poor quality foods. But Dr. Jennifer Souders, the medical director of the Diet Doc, physician and current powerlifting world record holder. Got to throw that in there, just to let people know that you are somebody with great authority. I thank you so much for coming on again, and we're going to keep picking off kind of one diet at a time. So going through the good diet, bad diet phase or series, we're gonna talk about all of them by the time we're finished.
Fun. Looking forward to it, Joe.
All right. Thanks, Jen. Have an awesome day.
You too, Joe.
And thank you guys for listening. We will catch you next time.